And we're live. Welcome, everybody, to yet another new diffs architecture design workflow weekly call. Patrick, you have the first point in the agenda. Let's go straight in.
Yep. So I did some profiling on the SSR POC using the Rails streaming feature. So TLDR version is I used the Rails profile env bar for GTK. So to replicate production-like environment compared to development, because development environment adds a lot of overhead. So this will help. And then yeah, so when I tested it on the large MR around 116 changes, I don't see long data recalls compared to the one on the call. It was last week. So this time it only took around 80 milliseconds for the diffs page request. But this is because we don't fetch diffs from Italy on MRs because we use object storage for diffs. But I think Italy pagination will still help here, especially when we want to display the first 5 diff files when the page loads. Yeah. So I actually have a question here. Does commit diff and other RPCs that we call or the support pagination? I don't know. I know the answer to that. Does anyone know?
I don't know, but I know somebody who will know. Um, so we have Justin Tobler. He attends the other time. He will know for sure. Um, I'm not very familiar with the RPCs, so Justin Tobler. Will know.
All right.
I,
Status ask question.
yeah, I was wondering, is this uh, are these the numbers for just the first GitLab request that we do before rendering the files, or is it for every GitLab request that happens in this processing? So that including requests in the Hammond template, because I think even though we are using Hammond templates from commits, they are still making GitLab requests within them.
This is for the diffs page requests, the streaming requests that we have on the POC. So a single request. And that's also including the handle templates. And it's so far there are only 3 GitLab that I see. Div stats, get gloves, and forgot the other one. But yeah, they only took around 80 milliseconds. So I'm not sure why. Probably maybe you have a bigger MR for testing.
It's actually really interesting because as we've seen locally, it takes around almost 3 seconds for me to get this data from Gitali when I'm in development mode. I wonder why it's so different if you enable a production environment. Is it because of some sort of caching?
It has something to do with Rails behavior on development environment. So if you use the Rails profile environment variable, it will do a lot of caching about the classes code level. Yeah, you can try that. You can try that on your local machine too. Let's see. Yep. In other findings, based on the profiling, big portion of the time spent is on syntax highlighting, which is we already expected, especially when we're highlighting 116 files. But caching it shows 50% improvement. So it was from 7 seconds, went down to 3.5 seconds, which is 50%.
Yeah, I was going to suggest highlighting in parallel. I almost got it working, and it broke just because inside the template we have Kitely calls, and Kitely doesn't like parallel execution. So if we can, for example, reuse some of the data coming from the first Kitely request in the template, I think we would be able to run it in parallel because all the data will be there already. I just don't know why exactly we need another Kitely call inside the template. I was thinking that all the data was already coming from Kitely, but it seems it's not the case.
Yeah, I think in the template we fetch blobs. There's a method, there's a helper method called in the template that actually fetch blobs. So that's probably why. But I'm not sure. I think highlighting in parallel is we're blocked with how gRPC client works. I think I haven't tried it. But when you tried it, what did you use for parallelism? Did you try using Ruby threads or something else?
I'll show you the code really quickly, how it looked like. Just a second. So we can do this. I made the shared object, so the data is shared between all the instances, and I used the parallel gem. We already have it in development mode, so it will work without installing any gems. And I said just write it all into this object, and as soon as you're ready, call this write function, and it will check if the result is in the results object. Then it will write it and increase the index. And after we've done with the parallel stuff, we do this once again. We check the keys that are left and just write them to the string. So if we finish the Kitely stuff, it should just work, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you push it to the branch? I could probably test something out. Because I'm thinking, what if we fetch the blobs outside of that parallel code? And
We
then
can
if it's already
have a sync maybe tomorrow about this to go through this, or I'll just send you the patch and then we also do this one, I think.
Yeah, we can sync up tomorrow. But can you push it so I can try it early in the morning?
Sure.
Awesome, thanks. Yep. So another finding is that rest of the big portion of the time is spent on rendering HTML. That's my assumption. So I still need to spike caching of rendered HTML. Yes, what you planned after all. So after you have the point. Next point.
Yes, I think it's related to your next point, so we can just do a segue to that. But yeah, the topic of like object storage and persisting overall has come up a couple times here, and it came up yesterday, like you mentioned there. So I was wondering, since we already have some detailed idea now of the path we're taking, is any of the proposed architecture incompatible with that? Can we still leverage that type of caching if available? Or is anything like conflicting with that?
Yeah, I was actually wondering about that too. Because object storage is not enabled by default. You have to configure it. So if it's not enabled, then where do we cache? It's like first thing is we cache in Redis, but it's recommended not to use Redis. So I'm thinking if not Redis, we use this, which is probably NFS, which is what we used to use before we moved to object storage. But,
so I'm not very familiar with how people are setting up GitLab and how our GitLab.com is set up. When we say object storage, what are we talking here? Is it S3? Is it what is it? Is it how fast is it?
Yeah, it's S3. It's S3 like. On production, as far as I know, we use Google Cloud Storage. But we also
But is
support
it
different. Go
is
ahead.
it like in the instance or is it external? Or could it be
It's-
external?
It could be external.
Right. So I'm worried about latency here. I'm worried about something that we want to be extremely fast at retrieving rendered. Like it cannot be slower than rendering the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And I know that it's built for static stuff and all the thing, but I just want to make sure that we still achieve that sort of speed.
Yeah. And also
But you could
compatibility.
go ahead.
Also compatibility. It's like it's simpler for us to maintain if there's a single storage solution that's available for everyone. Compared to like object storage, which is not always the
We don't have an issue specific for discussing caching, do we? I feel like we could pull Bob into that issue to kind of like start detailing that a little bit more. Or do we already have an issue for that?
I think I already have one, but it's
Okay.
yeah, I look for it. But I remember I created an issue about regeneration of cache. So it can't be related to that. That's what I look for it.
Yeah, let's do that and try to one of those that you have created already. Let's pull Bob into that discussion and see what we can detail into it. Um,
All right.
cool. Let's go to the next one. Your point about not being configured.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I'll probably ask Bob as well about this. What's the recommendation of scalability about it?
Right. I think that would be get a good recommendation from him. What I'm thinking is I'm seeing like one of the things that I keep coming back to is we want this to be easily reusable, right? And as we're taking a server-side rendered approach, it's already very I mean, I would say tightly coupled with the implementation we do, and you can't just out of the blue whip out a front-end component and it just works, right? It needs some back-end support and it needs to have some um, preparation for it to work. So the more variations we have, the more complex this reusability becomes. So it's something that I'm starting to be a little bit worried that if we have multiple ways of these things working, it's sort of like gets a little harder to use and harder to maintain. So I think I'm with you of like if we can find one way of caching that is ensured to be there, great. Then we can go later on and do some progressive enhancement. Like if you do have object storage, then we can potentially leverage it. But to have a baseline implementation for everybody would be like instead of going the other way of falling back, like a graceful degradation, it'd be the other way. Have a baseline using like one particular caching mechanism, even if it's not the best, it's something that is consistently available, and then using a better one if it's available. But again, it feels like object storage, if it's configurable by the client and everything, by the customer, it feels like at some point, some object storages might not be as performant as others. So there's some variation I would expect. But still, something to detail, I guess, on that issue potentially as well with Bob.
Yep, I agree. Yeah, look at this. I think it's tomorrow. I'll start talking about it.
Okay. Any more thoughts on this? Can we move on?
I'll just add one thought. I think we shouldn't be removing Redis out of this equation right away, because I have experience of using Redis with high load tasks and storing kind of large blobs of data there. You approach it quite differently, so we didn't request the whole thing right away. I think Redis allows you to specify a certain range that you can retrieve from Redis. In that way, you can sort of mimic how streaming works. So you can request stuff in parts and send it as soon as you receive it, and it won't saturate Redis as much as if you've requested the whole thing in a single request. So I think it's also worth exploring a little bit. And as far as I know, Redis also supports some sort of streaming, so you can actually write to Redis as an input stream and also read it as an output stream. So maybe that also could work for us.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Since Redis is also available to everyone, because we use Sidekick, and Sidekick use Redis. And yeah,
I think one question that Bob will have is exactly how much data we'll use, because I mean, if it's every diff in the application, then it's going to be quite a lot. So we're probably going to need some research and stuff, because we already started investigating into those numbers, number of diffs and everything like that, but we haven't really gotten down to bytes, how many bytes that would be, forecasting like an average size of MRs and that sort of thing. So probably need to do a little bit more digging. I'll be honest, I think we're leaning more towards you two, the backend part of this conversation, and Phil as well, to kind of like get to the bottom of this. I know that Stanislav is pushing a lot of this, but we're trying to find our way through this, but we need to kind of start getting like leveraging our experience with this kind of thing, that what works best in production. We want something that is reliable, it's fast, so whatever works. And I know I heard recently, I think Bob was mentioning that there's been some changes to the Redis infrastructure, how we're deploying it and how we're leveraging it. So there's definitely some things that could be interesting there for us to capitalize on. Maybe even have a specific caching call, or invite Bob for next week's session, although Patrick won't be able to make that. Maybe we can do a separate call just for caching, and then we can go from there. But I'm asking you to kind of leave that charge a bit, Patrick and Igor and Phil and Stanislav, to just like whatever needs to happen to figure out the caching, let's do it, and with a bit of urgency, because it's a key point. All the benchmarkings we have are kind of like on pair with the current implementation, and whenever I go to product to start prioritizing implementation for this, that won't be good enough, right? We need to show them the better scenario of when caching is enabled, it's going to be much faster than it is today to leverage the database, for example. So definitely, I know that like 3 times and 2 times is already a good improvement, 2 times faster. But we need to have a very compelling case to have this work prioritized. So yeah, just a nugget. Any more thoughts there?
yeah, just want to mention that we use Redis for the highlight cache on MR diffs. So that already contains HTML markup. So it's probably a good argument.
All right. All right, so moving on then, I have a little read-only point, just for convenience. My next question, so as I'm hearing the proposal for server-side rendered and pre-rendering 5 like n diff files and streaming the rest, what I'm hearing in the back is like this is a highly specific implementation, right? It's going to have a streaming API and everything. But what I'm thinking of is there's potentially similar cases that would benefit from for example, receiving for leveraging the streaming API without an offset, like without a pre-rendering thing. So as we're starting to implement this, we're definitely going to need to have some sort of like service mentality of like writing the API in a way that it works for us, but it can also be leveraged by other people consuming it for different things. And just that's just a note. I might be burned for so many years of using internal APIs, and every time somebody needs something from the public APIs, they're not there. So I want us to keep that in mind as we're developing this thing where we're building it for our solution, but we also need to be mindful that there's going to be probably some use cases that are going to be very parallel to this and would benefit from a public API. And I know that we probably wouldn't leverage GraphQL to have a streaming HTML pre-rendered thing. but we need to have it display available in a way that people can still consume it for a slightly related use cases. Does that make sense, or should we just go with a highly specific API endpoint as we're doing it so far? Anybody has thoughts?
I mean, if we go with server-side rendering, we'll definitely lose some of the internal APIs that we use right now because we won't just need them. And they also do quite a lot of things. So we have an API that does both highlighting, checks some of the permissions, and it's all in a single request. So if people are relying on that, they will have to change the way how they work. Also, I'm not sure how will be, for example, sending permissions back to the client. Will it be included on the page? Will be having a separate request? I don't know the details about that right now. If we plan to leave these APIs, I don't see a problem with just leaving them if the internal backend architecture doesn't change a lot. I don't think there's like something stopping us from marking them as legacy and use at your own risk.
I'm not too worried about those, to be honest, because we've always said that the current, like the batch diffs, the diff for path, all of those endpoints are not public APIs. We've always said that. So if they're leveraging that, that's on them. What I'm worried though is that in 5 years, we'll be in the same situation we're in today, where for the benefit of performance, we're using highly specific internal APIs instead of publicly facing APIs. And as we're now reassessing this and building new endpoints, I want us to go more towards the public endpoints version, whatever, like typical API design that would not put us in the same place in 5 years, right? And whatever that is, let's try to keep that in mind, prioritizing our own use case, but also thinking about maintainability, future feature development. As people want slightly variations from that, they can still all collaborate in a global public endpoint. Does that make sense? For these existing ones, I'm not really too worried about that. We could deprecate them in a major version easily, but the implementation for this, I expect to happen in parallel. We're not going to be rewriting the existing diffs. We're going to be writing a new on the side. And as we're ready to toggle the switch between those two, the evolution will take its course. And at a certain point, when we flip the switch for a little while, probably the major after that will turn off the internal endpoints or something. But that's still to be decided. It's going to be a long way before we get there.
I mean, we can definitely go with the public API. I'm just not seeing how useful it will be for people, for example, to get the pure HTML in the public API. Like, is it useful for you?
Could be.
I don't know.
It could be. And I'm thinking cases of like VS Code, we could actually take the benefit of having a consistent UI by dumping that in a web view. And I can see how it will be missing a lot of features because all the features will come from dynamic JavaScript that is running on top of it. But maybe because we're using web components, that could help like support that in more native environments that we don't foresee, right? But for now, I just don't want us to get I just don't want us to have the starting point as the problematic reality we have today of internal endpoints. That's it. Like whatever happens after that, we can like learn from that as we go. But not assuming that nobody will be thinking of using a pre-rendered HTML. That's my point. Like maybe they will, maybe they need it. And if they don't, fine, great. But at least we won't be again, going into the next generation of diffs with the legacy problem of having internal APIs. That's it. That's my point. Patrick, you unmuted yourself. You want to say something?
Yeah, I think I'm going to hit some versioning issues there. Like if we change the markup of what we server-side rendered, and then it affects other consumers, that would break their stuff. So I'm not really sure if we have to have it public because of that.
Sure. No, that's a question for like API design. Should we update that whenever the HTML changes, or I'm not the best person to decide that, but I just don't want us to build a walled garden around this, assuming nobody will use it. Just starting off from that point, I think will be, because remember, we want this to be reusable. And as we're having, we have extensions on multiple IDEs now, right? And they might be building features on top of the things we have today that could leverage these things we're building, right? So I don't want us to shut that door from the beginning. That's it. And again, even if the consumers are still GitLab teams, having that available as a public API endpoint would be beneficial for them, rather than, just call the batch diffs and get the information from there, because there's no expectation of that being permanent available. So let's keep that in mind. So what I'm saying is, for example, like the API should take an offset parameter of how many diffs it could jump at the beginning, which we would give a 5, and consumers would probably just not pass that parameter and just take the whole thing as a streaming, right? That's just an example of how we can alleviate the burden of the server-side rendered being sort of a requirement. It wouldn't be a requirement now. It will just be a streaming API that you can consume if you want to. But we, for the perceived performance perspective, we'll be server-side rendering a couple of them right away with the first request. But you don't have to if you want to consume this in an IDE or something, which would be problematic, I would say, to server-side render from the IDE. You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I think to deal with all of these problems with parameters and templates changing, we can go with a separate API that is just for public consumption, that uses a public template that will almost never change. And it has all the data you need. It marks all the structure in the div so that you can attach everything that you need. But for our case, we'll be customizing it heavily, adding stuff that requires more markup, for example. So that could work that way.
That means we'll have 2 layouts to maintain, but
well, we'll have to maintain we'll have to create one public and never touch it anymore, basically.
I'm thinking from the perspective, because I've been on the other side of writing the IDE integration. And what you want is to have the bleeding edge. What you want is like the new layouts to be available for rendering on the IDEs, right? And this can come because when we think about web components, we could have a bunch of information go in there. If we get to a point where we want styling to go with the components, we could get that through the web components, and that will be available on the web views inside the IDs and stuff. So I don't think we'll ever have a situation where public API will want to have an outdated version of diffs and not have the modern up-to-date version. I think a better conversation would be have a unified layout, but the layout might change, but will give you safe hooks to hook onto or something like a data attributes framework of like hooks to that you can hook on to particular areas of the diff or something, or not. We can totally decide how we can do that hooking on. Maybe we just assume that we'll provide the JavaScript code to enhance that to our version of diffs with interactions and all that stuff. Because remember, we're not going to be building merge request diffs. We're going to be building diffs viewer, wherever that is. So we're going to have to keep an agnostic view about what is this coming from? We can have some sort of like detailed knowledge of which scenarios will happen, but the reality will be that the idea is that this can be reused anywhere. As long as it provides a diff response, we should be able to render it. So we can't, I just don't want us to take this approach of a highly specific, tightly coupled to the scenario we're building and close the door of anything else. We have to keep this reusable. We have to keep this in a way that people can still use it in a way. So I would probably be voting against myself having 2 layouts, but maybe that's a conversation for a later stage, not right now on this call. But I just wanted to raise this right now because we're starting to document architecture, decision, and all that stuff. And as we're doing that, my mind went to, all right, is this going to be a GraphQL? No, because then we'd have to have a bootstrapping on the client to have GraphQL consumption, all that stuff. So those questions will come. but I would like us to steer away from internal APIs. That's my point. We can discuss that in the documentation stage of that part, okay? Cool. And speaking of that, documentation, so the last point was to, I wanted to bring up the thing. We're getting close to the target of the end of the month where we wanted to have the guidance for implementation documented on the new diffs page, the new diffs blueprint. And I was trying to think how we could do this as a group and be efficient about it. So we should want to start writing the permanent sections of the document. Right now, the document has a couple of proposals, some ideas floating around at the bottom. We want to start making those permanent things because it's starting to take shape in a much more mature way. And I want us all to think like, this doesn't mean that we won't have surprises along the way of implementation and have to tweak a few things. We just want to have a validated direction that we need to start off the development of this. This is not going to be the epic breaking down of tasks. It's just going to be the overall architecture that we're thinking about from the source to the rendered version, like all the steps throughout that. So what I was thinking is having setting up a couple of pairing sessions over the next couple of weeks to tackle specific sections of the documentation as a group. And I'm going to try to include the more frequent attendees here on the call. So potentially it's going to be somewhere along this time frame, this time zone, this time slot, to include all of us that are here. Because I want Patrick's input, I want Igor's input, I want Stanislav and Phil's input, and Carrie is definitely going to be a valuable input as well. But I just want to make sure that we have sessions where it's not included in the weekly, but specifically for authoring the documentation and specifically for getting that moving ahead. Or do you have any other ideas on how we could tackle the documentation? Does that sound good? Having specific sessions for it?
Yeah, I think that sounds good, but I think we can also start a sync, like you know, open an MR, discuss there, and then sync up.
Oh yeah, I don't want to stop you from doing that. My here as a moderator kind of thing, what I want to leave you to is leave Patrick time for the investigations, for the spikes and all that stuff. Stanislav, you're also validating a few things, and Igor as well. So the investigations of that already take a bunch of time. So the documentation of the thing will probably be the fastest part, is just documenting that into an MR. So yeah, I don't want to stop you from starting any MRs, but I also want you to focus on the nitty-gritty, heavy investigation efforts that you're doing. And then even I can take care of the markdown if it's properly out of the outcome of your investigations. I can take that and write the documentation myself if need be. But I just wanted to give you like a headspace where, all right, we're going to have that moment to document things. I don't have to spend time but before that. That's what I'm trying to do, is like get you the useful time for the investigation part. But if you want to start, go right away.
Got it.
More thoughts? Does that sound good? Cool. Then I'll do that. I'll get that set up. Anybody has any other points that you want to discuss? Then if not, we'll call it there. Thank you so much for all the push and the investigation. It's great to start seeing it take shape. So thanks everybody for the effort, and let's keep rolling. And I'll see you on another call somewhere. Thanks. Bye.